The Callahan farmhouse stood on a rise above the Kentucky hills, its white paint flaking with age, its roof sagging in the middle like a tired spine. To any traveler passing by, it looked no different from 100 other homes dotting the countryside during those years of war and hunger. Chickens wandered freely across the yard, a wooden swing creaked lazily from the branch of a walnut tree, and smoke rose in steady rhythm from the chimney. It gave the image of endurance, a family holding firm through hardship, the perfect picture of resilience in a fractured nation. Neighbors often remarked that the Callahans seemed blessed, untouched by the ruins spreading across the south, as if some private grace shielded their house. But the closer one came to the threshold, the more that sense of blessing soured into unease. The silence around the farmhouse was the first betrayal. Farms were never quiet in wartime. Livestock complained, children shouted, and women carried their songs into the fields. Yet here, the noise was wrong, absent in ways the human ear notices without understanding. The chickens made no sound. The dogs barked only once, then retreated as if scolded. The wind passed through the grass but not through the house, as if the walls refused to let it enter. To step near the porch was to feel the weight of that stillness pressing against the skin. Visitors would smile politely, comment on the neatness of the garden, but leave quickly, unable to explain why their hands shook as they untied their reins. Inside, the Callahan family moved with rehearsed grace. Daniel Callahan, the patriarch, spoke with calm authority, his words carefully measured, never wasted. His wife Mary carried the image of piety, her face framed in a bonnet, her eyes lowered with humility. Together they welcomed travelers, offered bread, and gave charity to the church. People whispered about their kindness. They took in orphans from the war, children abandoned by fleeing families, and were praised for their generosity in a time when most men barely fed their own. But there was something in the way the family moved together, as though each step, each smile, had been practiced before a mirror. Neighbors described them as polite, yet their politeness carried no warmth. When the Callahans laughed, it was quick and shallow, gone too soon, as though laughter was a trick they had been taught but never truly felt. The house itself carried its own secrets. The air inside was colder than outside, even on summer afternoons, a damp chill that clung to the walls. The wood beneath the carpets was scarred, hidden by rugs that never moved. Visitors would glance toward the stairway that climbed to the attic, only to find the door locked with a thick iron clasp. When asked, Mary would smile faintly and explain that the attic stored grain, or that the boards were too weak for safety. No one pressed further. In rural Kentucky, people respected privacy, and in times of war, secrets were abundant and rarely questioned. Yet those who stayed too long at the Callahan table spoke of hearing faint disturbances above their heads, soft movements that did not match the rhythm of the family gathered below. Daniel would clear his throat or raise his hand, and suddenly all noise stopped, as though the house itself obeyed his command. That it was easy to dismiss these impressions as imagination, tricks of nerves in a nation already filled with tension and blood. But unease lingered long after leaving the farmhouse. Some claimed the Callahans were simply blessed with discipline, that their children were obedient and respectful in ways rare for the age. Others admitted, in whispers they would not repeat publicly, that they felt as if the Callahans were not raising children at all, but containing something else, something kept hidden behind the walls and silence. And in the evenings, as the last light slipped across the hills, the farmhouse glowed in a way that unsettled even the most rational mind, like a lantern meant not to guide the lost but to warn them away. The Callahan name became one of trust in the town, praised for resilience, spoken of in sermons. Yet beneath that reputation, something darker pulsed in secret, waiting. The silence that clung to their home was not emptiness, but concealment, as though the farmhouse itself carried a breath it dared not release. And for those who passed it on horseback, their spines stiffening as they looked up at its quiet windows, the impression was always the same. The Callahans were not merely surviving the war. They were thriving in it, feeding on something no one else could see, something that hid in plain sight. The house waited, the family watched, and behind those whitewashed boards, history began to rot quietly, ready for the day the attic would finally be opened. The attic of the Callahan farmhouse was a place never shown, never spoken of, and never trusted even by the walls that held it. It had no windows, no cracks to let in the comfort of the moonlight, no escape for the stale air that clung to the beams like a shroud. The door was heavy, reinforced with an iron clasp that fastened from the outside, a lock not meant to keep danger from entering but to ensure that what lived within could not leave. Beneath the door, a thin strip of wood had been nailed tight, sealing the gap, as if the smallest sliver of light might betray the truth to anyone standing in the hallway below. For the Callahans, the attic was not storage. It was not a room. It was a chamber built for concealment, a place meant to hold the darkest secrets of the family, hidden above their own heads like a parasite feeding from. Inside, the floor was lined with straw mats that had rotted into blackened clumps, the kind used for livestock pens rather than for people. The smell never truly left. It was a mixture of mildew, urine, and something older, sweeter, that clung to the air like decay. Along the beams of the roof, rusted chains were bolted deep into the wood, their iron links scarred from years of use. Some hung loose, swaying faintly whenever the boards creaked, while others bore small cuffs shaped for wrists no bigger than a child's. The beams themselves told the cruelest truth. They were scarred with hundreds of shallow marks, crescents of fingernails gouged into the wood in desperate rhythm. Some marks ran deep, frantic, as though hands had clawed until the nails tore away. Others were faint, weak lines dragged across the surface by children too exhausted to press harder. In the attic's silence, these marks became voices of the past, frozen testimony of endless struggle. Night, the attic lived. Its silence fractured into muffled sobs, whimpers, and the occasional scream that rattled against the roof beams before being swallowed whole by the insulation of the house. The Callahans were masters of disguise. They told visitors that the wind through the hills could wail like lost children, a trick of the valley that confused the ear. And to those sitting by the hearth below, Daniel would lift his hand when the faint sounds rose, his stern eyes forcing his family into silence until the noise passed. The house returned to its calm, while above their heads, children bit their fists to smother cries that could betray them. To those who slept inside, the sound of suffering became as familiar as the crackle of firewood. It was background, woven into the very rhythm of the farmhouse. The attic's true horror was not only its chains or its darkness, but the ritual of how it erased those trapped inside. Daniel believed that a person stripped of light, air, and choice would reveal their essence, the soul torn open, raw, and exposed. So the attic was built to remove every comfort. There were no windows to mark the passage of day, no clock, no sense of time. Hours bled into days until the children forgot how long they had been held. Hunger gnawed at their bellies in carefully measured intervals. Never enough to die, never enough to live. Thirst was answered not with water but with ladles of brackish liquid from the trough. Those who resisted found themselves fastened to the chains, their wrists rubbed raw until flesh and iron fused in infection. Others, too weak to resist, sank into the straw, watching the darkness above until their eyes saw shapes that were not there, and still, the attic listened. It seemed alive in its way, collecting every sound, every gasp, every frantic heartbeat. Some children claimed they could hear voices from the wood itself, whispers urging them to give in, to let go, to become part of the silence that swallowed all others. Perhaps it was madness, perhaps something more, but the Callahans encouraged it, whispering through the cracks themselves at night, voices soft and gentle, pretending to be angels or spirits. They promised the children release if they endured. In reality, the attic was never meant to release anyone. It was a crucible, designed not to break bodies quickly but to grind down the spirit until nothing remained but obedience and despair. The townsfolk never saw it. They looked at the farmhouse and saw a family of discipline and faith, people who prayed before meals and cared for orphans. They heard faint cries carried by the wind and told themselves it was only the hills playing tricks. No one asked to climb the attic stairs. No one questioned why it was always locked. And so the attic remained unseen year after year, a place where innocence was starved, shackled, and silenced, while just below, a family carried on the performance of goodness. The attic was more than a room. It was a wound carved into the heart of the farmhouse, pulsing with quiet suffering that spread its infection through every board, every nail, every breath inside the walls. It was where the Callahans fed their secret hunger, where children were unmade, and where silence itself was forged into something heavier than sound. And as the war outside raged on, filling the world with death and fire, the attic above the Callahan family created its own war, one that left no graves, only shadows burned into wood, waiting for the day they would be discovered high in the countryside of Kentucky, where war had left homes abandoned and families scattered. The Callahans were admired for their unusual generosity. While other households shrank under the weight of famine, Daniel and Mary seemed to welcome more mouths with each passing season. They were spoken of as blessed by Providence, a family whose charity knew no bounds. When a child was left wandering the road after soldiers burned his farm, the Callahans took him in. When a girl appeared in town with no parents and no shoes, the Callahans promised her shelter. Families whispered that perhaps God had chosen them as guardians of the war's lost children. Ministers praised their devotion, sermons spoke of their kindness, and even those who felt uneasy dared not say otherwise. From the outside, the Callahan household looked full of life. At harvest festivals, Daniel arrived with children in tow, neatly dressed, standing obediently at his side. They did not laugh like the others, did not run with the reckless joy of youth, but stood quietly with downcast eyes, their hands folded. People explained it as discipline, a rare blessing in a time when hunger made children wild. Mary, with her gentle face and soft words, would touch each child on the shoulder, introducing them as though they were her own. They ate in silence, moved in silence, and returned home in silence. The townsfolk chose to see only piety where unease should have bloomed. The truth, hidden above the ceiling boards, was that the Callahans collected children not for love, not for charity, but for study. Each orphan was taken not into a family, but into a system, categorized by age, strength, and obedience. Daniel kept records in leather-bound books, his handwriting neat and merciless. Each entry noted the child's name, the town they had come from, and the condition of their body. Teeth examined, bones felt, eyes measured for clarity. To him, they were not souls in need of care, but subjects for observation, livestock for an experiment that had no end. The children did not sleep in warm beds, nor eat at the Callahan table. Their true dwelling was the attic, where cages of crude wood and rusted bars divided them like animals. Inside those cages, the Callahans studied how suffering reshaped innocence. Some children, newly taken in, still clung to hope, whispering prayers or songs in the dark, believing rescue would come. Others, broken by weeks of hunger, curled into themselves, no longer speaking. Daniel noted how long it took for a child's will to bend, how many days without food turned crying into silence, how many nights in chains erased the instinct to resist. He timed these transformations with precision, as though cruelty itself were a clock that revealed the hidden mechanism of the human spirit. Mary, for all her gentleness in public, assisted with calm devotion, feeding the children scraps not out of kindness but to prolong the study. Her quilts, stitched from their discarded clothes, became trophies, each thread a quiet confession woven into patterns of eyes and cages. The children lived as livestock, their every movement controlled, their every sound monitored. When Daniel entered the attic, the cages fell silent, as though the very air froze in fear. He walked the rows slowly, hands behind his back, eyes scanning each face. To him, their suffering was proof of order. Where others saw chaos in war, he saw opportunity to peel back the layers of humanity, to expose what lay beneath when all comforts were stripped away. He believed children revealed the purest form of this truth, unclouded by age, their spirits raw and malleable. In his mind, their suffering was not cruelty but revelation, a holy work disguised as science. The community remained blind. They saw only the Callahans' growing household and assumed they were saints. They explained the children's quiet obedience as gratitude, never imagining it was fear. They ignored the fact that none of the Callahan children grew into adulthood within the town, that few were ever seen for more than a year before vanishing altogether. Rumors of their disappearance were softened by Daniel's explanations. A relative reclaimed them, or illness carried them away. In an era where death touched every family, these excuses went unquestioned. Yet beneath the roof of the farmhouse, the truth festered. The attic groaned with the sound of chains, with whimpers too soft to travel beyond the walls. The Callahans continued their collection, their reputation shielding them from suspicion, their neighbors grateful that someone would take in the burdens they could not bear. And so, child after child disappeared into that house of silence, their names recorded neatly in Daniel's book, their innocence measured in days until it dissolved. The Callahan children were not a family. They were a harvest, gathered in secret, consumed in silence, and buried without graves. And as the war outside raged on, the attic above the farmhouse became its own battlefield, one where the victors were never the innocent, but the ones who knew how to hide their hunger behind the mask of kindness. Daniel Callahan did not see himself as a monster. In his own mind, he was a man of vision, chosen by circumstance to pursue truths others were too afraid to face. Where his neighbors prayed for rain and harvest, Daniel prayed for revelation. He believed that the soul, that hidden essence of a person, did not emerge in joy or comfort but in suffering. To him, the human spirit was like or buried in stone, worthless until broken and smelted in fire. And so, the farmhouse attic became his furnace, the children his raw material, their pain the tool by which he believed he could unlock the deepest secrets of existence. His notebooks filled slowly, each page a monument of cruelty disguised as order. He wrote with the precision of a scholar, never wavering, never straying into the chaos of feeling. Each child became an entry, reduced to initials and dates, their suffering charted in neat columns. He recorded their weight when they arrived, the clarity of their eyes, the sharpness of their teeth. Then came the experiments, rituals disguised as measurements, horror turned into data. Daniel's hand never shook as he wrote. To him, it was not madness but science, the cold collection of evidence for truths too great for others to grasp. One of his favorite studies was silence. He believed that words shielded the soul, that the constant noise of human speech concealed what truly lay beneath. And so he selected children one by one, locking them in darkness with strict command that no sound would pass their lips. The punishment for breaking the silence was swift: withdrawal of food, tightening of chains, days spent without water. The children learned quickly, their voices vanishing until even sobs became dangerous. Daniel recorded the transformation with fascination. After 1 week, the child's voice would tremble when finally allowed to speak. After 2 weeks, some lost the ability to form sentences altogether, their tongues stumbling over simple words. After 3, the silence broke something deeper, and Daniel noted how the eyes dulled, as though the spirit itself had retreated, unwilling to return. To him, this was proof that silence stripped away the false layers, revealing the raw emptiness beneath. Hunger was another of his obsessions. Daniel measured it with precision, rationing scraps of bread, drops of broth, nothing more. He charted how many days it took before a child's skin clung to bone, before they began to hallucinate, before their own minds betrayed them with visions. He watched as some clawed at the air, whispering to mothers who were not there. Others laughed without reason, their eyes wide, their voices frantic. One boy, after 16 days, claimed he could see angels dancing in the shadows of the attic. Daniel leaned close, writing every word, believing he stood on the edge of discovery. He wanted to know not how hunger killed, but how it remade the soul before death arrived. But his darkest experiments were reserved for water. Daniel believed death itself was not an ending, only a doorway. To test this, he created a ritual he called the drowning. Children were held under until their bodies spasmed, their lungs filling with icy water. Just before the final stillness, he dragged them back, reviving them with brutal care, pressing on their chests until water poured from their mouths. He repeated the process again and again, watching as their minds fractured with each forced return. Some emerged quiet, their eyes distant, as though part of them had stayed beneath. Others screamed for hours, unable to stop, their sanity broken. Daniel recorded each response, convinced that by pushing them to the threshold of death and back, he glimpsed the borders of the human soul. In his notes he wrote, "They return not whole. Something remains on the other side." Mary played her part in these rituals without hesitation. She was not the hand that drowned nor the one that struck, but she was the witness, the keeper of the aftermath. She cleaned the bodies, dressed the wounds, and stitched the clothing that marked each child's transformation. Her quilts grew heavier with symbols, each piece of fabric cut from a subject who had endured. To visitors, they looked like tokens of charity. To the Callahans, they were records, sacred relics of the suffering that revealed truth. The cruelty was not rage, not madness in the wild sense. Daniel did not lash out blindly or lose himself in frenzy. He was methodical, calm, deliberate. He did not scream at the children, nor curse them. Instead, he spoke in soft tones, instructing them as though guiding them toward a higher purpose. He told himself he was teaching them, unlocking them, shaping them into vessels of revelation. To him, their screams were not cries of pain but hymns of proof, evidence that the veil between flesh and spirit could be pierced. Outside the attic, life continued as if nothing stirred. The fields grew with grain, the chickens pecked in silence, and the Callahans greeted neighbors with smiles. None could imagine that above their heads, children gasped for air, starved into visions, or sank into the madness of silence. None could see the notebooks filling with ink, each line a scar cut not into paper but into the lives of those who would never be remembered. For Daniel Callahan, the attic was his laboratory, his temple, his stage. He believed the war outside had shattered the old world, and in its ruins he was chosen to build a new truth. Pain was his scripture, suffering his sacrament, and every child locked in his attic was another step toward revelation. In his mind, he was not cruel. He was a pioneer. And pioneers never look back at the bones they leave behind. To the Callahans, cruelty was never presented as cruelty. It was framed, dressed, and performed as ritual, a ceremony designed to transform the horror into something sacred. Daniel believed that suffering, when wrapped in symbols, took on the shape of revelation. Mary, devoted and meticulous, ensured that every detail looked holy, every cruelty cloaked in the illusion of purity. And so the children were made participants in a theater of pain, forced to wear innocence like a costume before it was stripped away piece by piece. The rituals began with the clothing. Mary stitched white smocks for each chosen child, garments cut from old linens, clean and plain. To the townsfolk, they resembled baptismal gowns, symbols of purity and renewal. To the children who wore them, they were uniforms of dread, marking them as the next to be taken. Once dressed, the chosen were led into the attic center, where straw was cleared and candles burned low. The Callahans stood as officiants, Daniel with his notebooks, Mary with her quilts folded neatly at her side, the other children pressed into silence in their cages. It was never announced what would happen, only that the chosen had been blessed, or cursed, by being selected. That Daniel's first ritual was starvation coupled with scripture. He believed the mind, when torn between hunger and holy words, revealed a truer form of devotion. The chosen child was given a Bible, its cover worn, its pages damp from many hands before. They were instructed to memorize passages, their recitations timed and recorded. But the child was denied food, their body weakening as their tongue struggled to shape the verses. At first, the words came strong, clear. By the second week, their voice faltered, slurring syllables, skipping lines. By the third, their breath rattled between phrases, the hunger louder than scripture. Daniel noted how the meanings twisted in their mouths, how desperation stripped the words of reverence until they became mere sounds. When at last the child collapsed, unable to continue, Daniel marked the page with calm satisfaction. The soul abandons scripture before the body abandons life. Another ritual belonged to Mary's design, a mirrored chest, polished within to reflect endlessly. The chosen child was placed inside, their body confined, their face forced to confront itself from every angle. A small slot allowed light to enter, just enough for the reflections to shimmer, cruel and unending. For hours, then days, the child watched themselves wither, their skin hollowing, their eyes sinking. The chest trapped not only their body but their identity, forcing them to witness their own decay without escape. Mary stitched their clothes afterward, sewing symbols of broken circles and shattered faces into her quilts. To visitors, the patterns seemed decorative. To her, they were sacred records of the child's descent. Some ceremonies were colder, stripped of even the pretense of teaching. Daniel devised one he called the baptism of ash. The chosen was coated in soot from the chimney, their skin darkened until no trace of innocence remained. They were then denied water, left to cough and choke as the ash clung to their lungs. He recorded each gasp, convinced the act revealed how quickly purity could be defiled and erased. Others were made to kneel on salt for hours, their flesh blistering beneath them, or to carry weighted stones in their arms until their bones gave way. Each ritual had a purpose, or at least Daniel convinced himself it did. To him, these were not punishments but offerings, acts of devotion to a truth larger than any church could imagine. The deaths that followed were not hidden or forgotten. Daniel recorded them as though they were sacrifices laid upon an altar. He wrote of their final moments with calm detail, how one child whispered prayers until their voice failed, how another stared blankly at the ceiling as though already seeing a world beyond. Mary collected their garments, cutting away pieces for her quilts, weaving the symbols of their rituals into patterns that only she and Daniel could read. The dead themselves were not buried in marked graves. Their bodies were carried into the woods at night, left in shallow earth or beneath stones, returned to silence as though they had never existed. Only the quilts, the notebooks, and the attic bore their memory. The other children, still alive, were forced to watch or listen, their cages positioned so they could see the rituals. They were made witnesses, participants through fear alone. Each ceremony reminded them of what waited if they resisted, each smock a death shroud disguised as purity. And yet, in the hollow silence that followed, some whispered prayers, others hummed broken lullabies, clinging to each other through the cracks of the dark. These sounds never lasted long. Daniel punished them, returning to his silence experiment, ensuring that no voice rose above the rituals he commanded. The Callahan's cruelty, cloaked as ceremony, fooled even themselves. They convinced their own minds that the suffering had meaning, that it was not mere violence but a sacred unveiling of truth. In this way, the rituals did more than destroy children. They destroyed the very boundary between kindness and horror. To their neighbors, Daniel and Mary were caretakers, pious and charitable. But in the attic above, they had built a church of suffering, an altar where innocence itself was sacrificed in silence, and the rituals never ended. Each time a child perished, another was chosen. Each quilt became heavier, each notebook thicker, each candle burned lower into the night. The Callahans had convinced themselves they were not killing. They were keeping record, giving form to what no one else dared study. But the truth was simpler and darker. They had turned torture into liturgy, death into worship, and innocence into their most treasured offering. Mary Callahan's hands were always busy, fingers moving in steady rhythm as the needle pierced and pulled, pierced and pulled. To the neighbors who sometimes stopped by, she appeared the image of a good wife and mother, keeping her home warm with quilts stitched from scraps of old garments. They admired the craftsmanship, the patience, the neatness of every seam. They spoke kindly of her, whispering how blessed the Callahans were to have such a woman tending their household. What they could not see, what they would never see, was the truth hidden in the fabric itself. For Mary's quilts were not born from love but from death, and each thread carried the weight of a child's final breath. When a chosen child died, it was Mary who gathered what remained. She handled their garments with an almost religious reverence, folding the smocks and shirts as though preparing them for burial. But there was no grave waiting. Instead, she cut away what she needed: a sleeve from one, a collar from another, strips of cloth where sweat and blood had once seeped through. Each fragment became a piece of her work, stitched into patterns no outsider could decode. To visitors, the quilts seemed quaint and charming, decorated with spirals, eyes, cages, and circles broken apart. But to the children who remained in their cages, those shapes were not harmless designs. They were marks of remembrance, twisted memorials that recorded every ritual, every scream, every death. The spirals were the most frequent. Mary stitched them in endless whirls, looping again and again until the fabric looked dizzy with motion. To her, the spiral represented the descent into silence, the way a child's mind unraveled as hunger and isolation consumed them. The eyes came next, embroidered with chilling precision, unblinking and cold. They were the reflections from the mirrored chest, the faces children were forced to confront as they decayed within their own prisons. And the cages, lined in sharp, angular thread, stood for the beams of the attic, for the chains and straw where little bodies had trembled. Each quilt was less a blanket than a ledger, a woven history of torment disguised in patterns of comfort. The quilts covered the Callahans' home. They hung over chairs, draped across beds, stacked neatly in cedar chests as though meant for inheritance. Visitors would comment on how warm and homely the farmhouse felt, how Mary's hands seemed to bring peace to every corner. Some even asked her to sew for them, praising her as a woman of rare skill. Mary would smile politely, demurring, her hands tightening over the fabric she would never part with. These quilts did not belong to the living. They were offerings, holy to her, the only way she could contain what they had done. In every stitch, she preserved the children's suffering, keeping it from fading into the void. For the surviving children locked in the attic, the sight of the quilts was unbearable. Whenever Mary passed with her needlework, they saw not warmth but horror disguised as beauty. Some recognized their own clothes, stripped from them before a ritual, now transformed into a decorative square. Others traced with their eyes the familiar stains that Mary had chosen not to wash away, dark blotches that might once have been theirs. The symbols mocked them, turning their nightmares into patterns to be admired by outsiders who would never understand. To them, the quilts were not blankets. They were shrouds. Mary herself believed she was honoring the dead. In her quiet, obedient way, she convinced herself that the work was sacred, that she was preserving something larger than life. When her needle pricked her skin and blood stained the thread, she whispered to herself that it was a sign, a communion with the lost souls she stitched into her work. Each quilt became a prayer she could not speak aloud, a testimony to what she dared not confess even to her husband. And yet, beneath that fragile devotion, there was also pride. She admired her own skill, the way her patterns concealed truth from the world. Her horror had become art, and the secrecy of it made her feel powerful. Daniel, too, saw value in her needlework. Where his notebooks held the science of pain, Mary's quilts held the theology, the scripture of their rituals. Together, they made a perfect record, his words and her stitches, cold logic and haunting beauty. He often touched the fabric while writing, tracing the shapes with his fingers as though drawing inspiration from her work. To him, the quilts were proof that what they were doing was not madness but method, not chaos but order. The suffering of children had been catalogued, given permanence, transformed into something the world could never erase, and so the quilts multiplied. One by one, they filled the farmhouse, until no room was free from the presence of the dead. Each night, when the house grew still and only the muffled whimpers from the attic could be heard, Mary continued to sew by candlelight. The glow lit her face in fragments, shadow and flame flickering across her expression as the needle flashed in and out of cloth. She never hurried, never faltered. Her work was slow, steady, endless. The sound of the needle passing through fabric became part of the silence, a quiet rhythm that joined the cries disguised as wind. Those who visited would never guess that every quilt they touched was woven from agony. They smiled as they ran their hands over the fabric, praising its warmth, its softness, its beauty. And Mary would smile in return, nodding gently, hiding the truth with her silence. Yet the survivors in the attic knew. They saw her every day, moving with calm devotion, her needle tracing the outlines of their fate. They knew that if they died, their clothes too would be stripped, their pain transformed into another square on her tapestry of horror. And as they shivered in their cages, they understood the cruelest truth of all. In the Callahan farmhouse, even death did not free them. They would live on forever in Mary's quilts, immortalized not as children but as patterns of suffering, stitched into the fabric of the home that had devoured them that 18 night. When the house grew still and the lanterns were snuffed, the Callahan farmhouse did not sleep. Beneath its whitewashed boards and heavy beams, a softer sound began to stir, almost imperceptible at first, faint whispers threading through the walls like currents of air. The children who remained alive in the attic had discovered that the cracks between planks, the gaps where nails had loosened, carried their voices across the rooms. It became their only salvation, a fragile lifeline to one another in the darkness. Through those thin seams, one child would hum a lullaby, broken and quiet, and somewhere beyond, Another would join, barely audible yet unmistakably human. The songs carried not hope but endurance, an instinct to remind themselves they were not utterly alone. That he voices spread across the wood like veins, ghostly but alive, weaving together in strange, mournful harmony. A boy might whisper his name, pressing his lips against the crack in the wall, and hours later he would hear it repeated back by a girl he had never seen. A small child might weep, and from beyond the beams a soft hand-shaped rhythm would tap in reply, a promise that someone still listened. The farmhouse became an instrument of survival, its warped boards and hidden cavities transforming into channels for sorrow and solidarity. And yet, for every voice that joined, there was always one that fell silent. The silences came suddenly. One night a voice would sing, frail but determined, and the next it would be gone, leaving only a hollow absence where words had once traveled. The children learned not to ask what had happened, for they already knew. They had seen too many chosen and taken, heard too many cries that ended in quiet. Instead, they adjusted, reshaping their fragile network, clinging to whatever threads remained. But the growing gaps in their chorus pressed against them with unbearable weight, teaching them that every lullaby might be a farewell. The Callahans, though deaf to the innocence behind the whispers, were not entirely unaware. Daniel occasionally paused in his writing, frowning as he thought he heard a hum beneath the creaks of the house. Mary sometimes raised her head from her sewing when a faint song reached her, though she dismissed it as the wind curling through the boards. The family convinced themselves these sounds were nothing more than the house itself breathing, an old building groaning under time and weather. But the survivors knew the truth. These were not the echoes of timber or storm. They were the voices of children trying to keep each other alive by filling the dark with words. Some of the whispers turned into secret rituals of their own. They counted together in murmurs, tracing numbers as though marking the days, though none knew how much time had passed. They recited scraps of scripture they remembered from before, not because they believed, but because repetition gave shape to the void. Some even traded memories, what a mother's hand once felt like, the smell of summer grass, the face of a sibling lost. These fragments passed like contraband through the walls, feeding the imagination of others who had nothing left to remember. In this way, the children created a hidden language, fragile but enduring, their own resistance against silence. Yet the farmhouse did not preserve these voices forever. As weeks stretched into months, the whispers grew fainter, the songs slower, until even the survivors began to confuse them with the house's groans. Memory became slippery. They wondered if they had imagined the boy who once hummed every night, or the girl whose laughter briefly cracked through despair. The voices blurred into echoes, and the echoes into nothing. It was as if the house itself was swallowing them, absorbing every syllable into its walls, binding their lives to its structure. The children had tried to outlast the silence, but in the end, the silence always won. Years later, when investigators finally tore open the attic and laid bare the farmhouse's horrors, some swore they heard faint sounds as they worked, like distant humming hidden in the beams. Survivors who lived long enough to speak recalled the songs and whispers as the only light they had ever known in that place. They said it was not ghosts they had heard, but each other, fragile threads of humanity stretched thin across the darkness. And yet, those who entered the house afterward could not shake the feeling that the boards still remembered. When the wind moved across the fields and slid through the cracks, it carried with it the echo of children's voices, rising and falling like a lullaby no one should have ever needed to sing to be why the winter of 1864, the hills of Kentucky were hollowed by hunger. War had drained the land, soldiers stripped fields of corn, and neighbors spoke of famine in whispers that carried no promise of relief. The Callahan farm, isolated yet watchful, was not spared. The cellars ran low, barrels once brimming with salted meat stood empty, and every day the family measured their rations with growing unease. But where others despaired, Daniel Callahan saw opportunity. For him, hunger was not a curse. It was a tool, an element as sharp as a blade and as revealing as fire. When deprivation. Daniel Callahan saw opportunity. For him, hunger was not a curse. It was a tool, an element as sharp as a blade and as revealing as fire. When deprivation entered the house, he did not seek to ease it. He chose instead to shape it, to bend starvation into an instrument for his work that he called it the culling. To Mary and the older Callahan children, he explained it as a necessary trial, a way to conserve food while deepening their holy study. To himself, in his neat and meticulous notes, he described it as an experiment designed to peel back the final layers of innocence. 39 children were placed together in the attic with only one bowl of thin gruel delivered daily. The portion was laughable, barely enough to sustain a single frail body, let alone dozens. Daniel gave no instructions on how it should be shared. He wished to see what desperation would teach them, how quickly hunger would strip away bonds of kinship and memory. The attic became a crucible, and he sat below with his pen ready, listening. The first days passed with uneasy restraint. The children tried to take turns, scraping the bowl with trembling hands, passing the thin liquid to mouths too small to swallow much at once. Some whispered prayers as they ate, others sang lullabies through cracked lips to ease the torment. They clung to scraps of order, mimicking the rituals they once used to survive their captivity. But the hunger grew sharper, carving them from within, and the bowl's arrival became less an act of mercy than a battlefield. By the end of the first week, whispers turned to quarrels, quarrels to shoves, and soon to blows. Daniel noted each change with fascination. He wrote of how long it took for civility to vanish, of how many nights passed before the first child struck another for a scrap of bread. He wrote of how small acts of sharing grew into bitter resentments, of how quickly the frailest among them were forgotten. He watched with quiet awe as hunger erased all illusions of innocence. Children who once sang to one another through the walls now hissed curses in the dark. Those who had comforted the weak now shoved them aside. The attic had become more than a prison. It had become a cage where survival was bought with cruelty. The air grew fetid with the smell of unwashed bodies, of sickness spreading between the mats, of vomit where children had eaten too quickly after days of waiting. Daniel called it natural cleansing, a stripping down of what he believed were false notions of love and care. In his eyes, hunger revealed the soul's true marrow, and what he saw was not innocence but violence dressed in desperation. Each act of cruelty, each betrayal for a spoonful of gruel, confirmed what he already believed, that suffering did not purify but exposed. Mary sewed as the cries echoed through the beams, her fingers stitching faster when the sounds of fighting rose. She did not question her husband's method, though her quilts grew darker, more crowded with spirals and eyes that no longer resembled patterns of beauty. The older Callahan children delivered the bowl each day, sometimes laughing as the attic erupted into chaos the moment it touched the floor. They were raised to believe this was holy work, a theater of truth unfolding above them. To them, it was not cruelty but ritual, the children in the attic less victims than sacrifices. As the days lengthened into weeks, the attic became unrecognizable. Once there had been songs, whispers, faint lullabies that traveled through cracks in the walls. Now only the sounds of gnawing and cries remained, interrupted by sudden silences when another body went still. The children tore at each other not out of malice but from an instinct deeper than thought. Some learned to steal in the dark, waiting for others to collapse before seizing what little they had. Others clung together in fragile groups, defending their portion for as long as they could, though even these alliances dissolved under the pressure of hunger. Daniel wrote that he had witnessed love transform into violence, and violence into silence, with a swiftness that proved his theory. Innocence was nothing more than an illusion of abundance. By the end of the experiment, the attic was no longer a place of whispers but of hollow-eyed silence. The bowl returned each day to fewer and fewer hands. The children who survived no longer sang through the walls, no longer tapped on the beams for comfort. Their voices were too weak, they were consumed by the daily scramble for one spoonful of gruel. They had been reduced to what Daniel desired most, creatures of survival, stripped of humanity, transformed into reflections of the hunger that bound them. Outside, winter still gripped the hills. Neighbors spoke of famine, of the cold claiming the weakest in every household. Yet none imagined that within the Callahan home, hunger had been sharpened into a weapon, turned against those who had no voice to resist. The farmhouse remained quiet, its whitewashed walls unremarkable against the snow. Only those within knew that its attic had become a cage of desperation, A place where children once called innocent had been forced to prove otherwise, and Daniel, quill in hand, believed he had uncovered the most profound truth of all, that starvation was not merely the absence of food, but the death of love itself. The storm broke without warning, tearing across the Kentucky hills in a violence of rain and wind that rattled shutters and bent trees to their knees. In the darkness, neighbors huddled by their fires, listening to the world shake. But at the edge of the storm, near the Callahan farmhouse, one man swore he heard something different, something the storm was trying to smother but could not. Between the thunder and the groan of the wind, there were voices, thin and breaking, drifting through the fields. They were not the cries of weather or beast. They were children that he followed the sound through the rain, stumbling up the path toward the Callahan house, where lanternlight glowed faintly through the shutters. The closer he came, the clearer the voices grew, high, trembling, layered in a chorus that rose and collapsed with each gust. They seemed to come from above the farmhouse, seeping through the roof like the storm itself. He stood in the mud, heart pounding, listening as a single note of song broke away from the others, a lullaby carried weakly through the gale. It was impossible, and yet it was undeniable. Something lived in the attic. By dawn, whispers spread through the town. The Callahans had long been praised for their charity, for taking in children when no one else would. But charity had no reason to hide itself in the rafters of a farmhouse. The sheriff, weary from years of war-torn lawlessness, could not ignore the stories. He gathered a handful of men and rode out through the wet fields. The storm had left the earth soaked and heavy, the air damp with the smell of rot and mud. When they reached the Callahan house, Daniel stood on the porch, polite but watchful, his smile too thin to be trusted. The sheriff demanded to see the attic. Daniel's refusal was calm, measured, cloaked in civility. There was nothing above but storage, he said, nothing worth their time. But the storm had shaken something in the men, a suspicion they could not bury. The sheriff ordered the door broken open. The Callahans stood in silence as the men forced their way up the narrow stairs, prying at the heavy lock until the wood splintered and the chain clattered loose. What waited beyond was not storage. It was not charity. It was horror that stole the breath from every man in that room. The attic was a cavern of stench, the air so thick with sickness and filth that some gagged before they could take a step. Straw mats were soaked through with waste, bodies curled upon them like husks. Chains hung from beams, their rust biting into wrists so thin they seemed carved from bone. 39 children stared back at the intruders with eyes hollowed by starvation, their lips cracked, their skin drawn so tight it seemed barely able to contain them. Some tried to rise but collapsed under their own weight, the effort of lifting their heads enough to drain what little life remained. Others did not move at all. The smell was unbearable. Rot, sweat, sickness, and something deeper, the scent of despair made physical. It filled the lungs, pressed against the chest, and clawed at the stomach. One man retched in the corner, another wept openly, unable to look. The sheriff stood frozen, his hands still on the doorframe, paralyzed by the enormity of what he saw. These were not strays saved by kind neighbors. These were captives, stripped of childhood, gnawed away by hunger until only the outline of suffering remained. The children themselves did not cry out. Their voices had been spent long ago. The few who stirred reached weakly toward the light, their fingers trembling in the air as though unsure if it was real. Some whispered words that could not be understood, syllables slurred by thirst and fever. Others only mouthed soundless pleas, their eyes too tired to widen in shock. The storm outside had roared, but here in the attic there was no sound left to give. The men who stood witness that morning would never speak of it without shuddering. They would say later that the silence was worse than the smell, worse than the sight of bones pressing against skin. The silence was absolute, heavy, broken only by the faint clink of chains when a child shifted. It was the silence of a place where innocence had been buried, replaced by something too monstrous to name. The sheriff descended the stairs like a man carrying death itself. He faced the Callahans, who stood waiting in the kitchen as though nothing had been disturbed. Daniel's expression was calm, unreadable, his hands folded neatly before him. Mary's gaze was fixed on the floor, her fingers twitching as if longing for the needle and thread she had left behind. The older Callahan children lingered at the edges, their eyes blank, their mouths tight with a loyalty that refused to crack. The sheriff's voice shook when he spoke, ordering the Callahans under arrest. Yet even as he said it, he knew there was no punishment that could measure what he had seen. The neighbors who had come to watch from the yard stared in horror as the first of the skeletal children were carried down, their limbs dangling like cloth. Mothers wept, fathers swore vengeance, and still the Callahan farmhouse stood silent, whitewashed walls hiding years of cruelty that had grown in plain sight. That morning, the town understood the truth it had refused to see. The Callahans had not been saviors. They had been monsters living behind a mask of generosity. And their attic, hidden just above the rooms where neighbors once drank and laughed, had been a cage of unspeakable suffering all along. The Callahans were marched into custody under the gray sky of late winter, their hands bound, their faces strangely calm. The people of the town lined the streets, some spitting, others staring in disbelief. Yet even as the family was taken, there was no triumph in the air. What had been uncovered in that attic was too terrible to be shouted about, too large to fit within the narrow frame of public justice. What began as an arrest soon dissolved into something quieter, something less like justice and more like a burial of truth. The children who had survived were scattered. Some returned to distant families who received them with shame, others placed in poorhouses or sent away to institutions where no one asked questions. The town could not bear to keep them close, for every pale face and hollowed body was a reminder of what had been allowed to happen under their watch. And so, while their captors were locked in cells, the victims themselves were quietly erased, dispersed into silence like ash carried by the wind. When the trial began, it did not resemble a public reckoning. There was no crowded courthouse, no angry mob demanding vengeance. Instead, the proceedings were hushed, stripped of spectacle. Only a handful of officials attended, joined by men in black coats who seemed less concerned with justice than with preservation of order. Witnesses were called, but their testimonies recorded behind closed doors, their words sealed in ledgers that would never see the light of day. Neighbors who had once wept openly now refused to take the stand, claiming they knew nothing, that they had seen nothing. The shame of having lived beside monsters weighed heavier than any desire to expose them. Daniel Callahan spoke during the hearings, but his words were not those of a man pleading for mercy. He described his work in calm, deliberate tones, calling it research, insisting it was sacred inquiry into the nature of suffering. His notes were collected, pored over by men who should have destroyed them but instead preserved them with interest. It was said that certain officials saw value in what he had recorded. His measurements of hunger, his timings of silence, his observations of the mind as it cracked under torment. These men did not call him a scientist, yet they did not entirely call him a madman either. To them, he was a source of knowledge, however forbidden, and knowledge was something too useful to waste. Mary remained silent. She sat with her hands folded in her lap, her gaze lowered, her lips pressed tightly together. When asked about the quilts, she admitted only that she had sewn them, refusing to say more. Her silence unnerved the court, but it also protected her. Without confession, without outcry, she was harder to condemn. Some whispered she was as guilty as her husband, others claimed she was a victim herself. But no verdict was ever spoken in public. Her fate, like the trial itself, was swallowed by secrecy. The Callahan children who had aided in the rituals stood before the court as well, their faces blank, their words rehearsed. They claimed obedience, duty, ignorance. And perhaps the officials believed them, or perhaps they simply chose not to look too closely. The truth was that too many in power did not want the story told. The war had left the nation fractured and starved. Another scandal would only deepen wounds. It was easier to call the case closed, to bury it under layers of silence than to drag it into the light. And so the verdict came quietly, whispered rather than declared. The Callahans disappeared into custody, though where they were held, or if they were ever truly punished, was never made clear. Some said Daniel was executed, his body burned with his papers. Others insisted he lived on in some distant asylum, still writing, still dreaming of experiments that would never end. Rumors spread that his notes had not been destroyed but copied, passed hand to hand among men who wanted to understand suffering not to prevent it, but to use it. The official record, when consulted in later years, was empty. Pages missing, testimonies sealed, names erased. The trial became a ghost, a proceeding that technically occurred but left behind no trace. The children who died in the attic were buried without markers. Their graves, dug hastily in frozen ground, were left unnamed so that families would not have to claim them, so the town could move forward without the weight of memory. Without names, without stones, the children slipped into history as shadows, their suffering hidden just as the trial had been hidden. To speak of them was to invite shame, and so the community chose silence, letting time and forgetting do what justice had not. Years later, whispers persisted. Some claimed powerful men had visited the trial, leaving with fragments of Daniel's notebooks. Others spoke of quilts that had survived, hidden away, their patterns recognized by those who dared remember. But in public, no one mentioned the Callahans. Their name was struck from records, their story left untold. It was as though the farmhouse, the attic, the 39 children had never existed at all, yet silence is never complete. Generations later, when descendants stumbled upon fragments of testimony or when ruins of the farmhouse were uncovered, the horror resurfaced like a body that refused to stay buried. The trial no one spoke about had become a legend, its absence from history more telling than its presence would have been. And those who unearthed it understood the cruelest truth of all, that sometimes society does not destroy evil. It buries it, hides it, even protects it, so that its lessons can be studied in secret, and the children, whose graves bore no names, remained voiceless beneath the soil, their suffering remembered only by the silence that had once filled the attic above. The town wanted to be rid of it. The Callahan farmhouse stood like a wound on the hillside, its white paint weathering to gray, its windows staring blank and hollow into the valley. 4 years after the trial, it remained unclaimed, unentered, a carcass of wood and stone that refused to fall. The people whispered that such a house should not remain standing, that it carried in its timbers the weight of what had been done there. And so, quietly, without announcement, they decided the farmhouse must be burned. Fire, they said, would cleanse it. The first attempt came in spring, when a group of men carried torches to the yard and tossed their flames against the rotting walls. For a moment, the wood caught, flaring bright against the night. But then the sky opened, sudden and violent, pouring rain that drowned the flames before they spread. The men staggered back, cursing, soaked through, their torches sputtering into black smoke. By morning the house stood unchanged, only streaks of ash marking where fire had kissed it and failed. The second attempt came in summer, when another group dragged barrels of oil up the hill and poured them along the beams, soaking the floors, their boots sloshing through the slick black puddles. A match was struck, a column of flame rose, and for a moment the house seemed to glow like a lantern. But then, as though the earth itself had turned against them, a sudden gust roared through the valley, snapping the fire back upon them. One man's clothes caught, and he screamed as the others beat out the blaze. They fled, scorched and terrified, leaving the house still standing, smoke drifting from its eaves like a mocking breath. The third attempt was darker. Men came at night with shovels and hammers, planning not to burn but to dismantle. They broke windows, smashed doors, tore at the walls with iron bars. But their work faltered when strange sounds rose from inside. The men swore they heard scratching, faint but steady, like fingernails across wood, coming from the attic. Some said it was rats. Others insisted it was something else, something older, something trapped. One by one they dropped their tools and left, unwilling to touch the beams that seemed to pulse with hidden life. Years passed, and still the farmhouse stood. Weeds swallowed the fence, ivy climbed its sides, yet the bones of the building did not give way. Children dared each other to run to its porch, but none stayed long. They claimed they felt eyes watching from the dark windows, or heard whispers in the boards beneath their feet. At night, when the wind shifted, the townsfolk said they could hear faint cries drifting down the hill, the echoes of voices long buried. Some called it superstition, others called it guilt, but no one dared go inside. The attic, above all, remained untouched. Its door was locked, rusting but firm, as if the house itself guarded it. Storms came, tearing at roofs across the valley, but the attic roof never buckled. Lightning struck nearby trees, splintering them to ash, Yet the farmhouse endured. Snow collapsed barns and cottages, but the attic beams remained. It was as though the house carried a will of its own, an unwillingness to be destroyed, as if it held something that would not be released. Decades blurred together. Generations rose and passed, but the farmhouse remained a silent monument, avoided yet never gone. Some locals swore that on certain nights, if one stood close enough, the faintest scratching could still be heard from within, like desperate fingers clawing at wood. Others claimed to see pale figures at the windows, small and unmoving, watching with hollow eyes. Whether it was imagination, memory, or something darker, no one could say. But the town agreed on one thing: the farmhouse was not merely a ruin. It was a vessel, carrying the weight of all that had been done inside, and it would not be erased by fire or time. And so it remained year after year, its timbers rotting yet unbroken, its attic locked and listening. A house that should have burned, but never did. A house that would not die. Time passed, and the Callahan name faded into the silence of rural Kentucky. The farmhouse, for decades avoided, was eventually erased by progress, plowed under for farmland, its foundations left to rot. Yet what happened inside those walls did not vanish. It lingered in fragments, in papers and objects too stubborn to decay, in whispers passed down through families who pretended not to remember. The Callahans had hidden their cruelty behind the mask of normalcy, and that mask proved harder to destroy than the house itself. The first discovery came in the 1890s, when a clerk sorting through neglected courthouse boxes found a trunk mislabeled as land deeds. Inside, bound in cracked leather, were Daniel Callahan's notes. They were not the writings of a man who believed himself a monster. They were tidy, deliberate, almost academic. He described starvation not as torment but as experiment, charting hallucinations and breakdowns as though recording the weather. He timed how long children cried before they stopped. He measured the tremors in their hands as hunger hollowed them. In cold, steady handwriting, he stripped suffering of humanity and turned it into data. Other fragments surfaced over time. Quilts stitched by Mary Callahan appeared at estate sales, admired for their craftsmanship by buyers who did not understand the meaning of the embroidered eyes and spirals, or the faint bloodstains preserved in fabric. County records yielded sealed coroner reports, clinical and restrained, that spoke of skeletal remains and broken bones without ever naming them as children. And in letters exchanged between neighbors, hints emerged, lines about strange cries on the wind, about too many little ones in that house. No single discovery told the full story, but together, they formed a jagged puzzle, impossible to ignore once assembled. Historians who studied the fragments were unsettled less by the brutality itself than by how carefully it had been hidden. The Callahans lived as models of generosity, taking in the abandoned and orphaned, praised for their charity while their victims starved in chains. Their cruelty did not resemble the chaos of madness. It was structured, rehearsed, defended by the silence of an entire community. That realization made the story more dangerous than any tale of wild violence. The Callahans had proven that the worst horrors could wear the calm face of normal life. By the mid-20th century, scholars of medical ethics began to cite the Callahan notes, not openly in lectures, but in closed discussions. They saw in them the raw example of what happens when human life is treated as material for study. In those quiet meetings, the notes became warnings, underlining why strict codes of consent and protection were necessary. The children of the Callahan attic had, unwillingly, shaped the boundaries of science. Their deaths haunted laws that sought to prevent such cruelty from ever wearing the mask of research again. Even so, the silence remained heavy. Families who had lost children chose not to claim the graves. To admit the truth meant admitting their own trust had been betrayed, their own choices had led sons and daughters into the hands of neighbors they believed kind. Shame became its own coffin, burying names deeper than soil ever could. And so, most of the children's resting places remained unmarked, their stories reduced to murmurs, their suffering diluted into local folklore. The community, unwilling to carry the weight directly, reshaped the horror into superstition. Parents warned children never to wander the hills alone, whispering that the Callahans would return for strays. Teenagers dared each other to approach the ruins of the farmhouse, to press their ears to the boards and listen for scratching. The tale became a ghost story, easier to tell by firelight than the truth, that ordinary people, respected and trusted, had turned their home into an attic of cages, and yet, even as the legend blurred, the fragments continued to surface. Each discovery forced new reflection, new unease. The Callahans could not be dismissed as demons or beasts, they were too human. Daniel had been a father, Mary a mother, both of them moving easily among neighbors who nodded in greeting. That ordinariness made the story unbearable, for it revealed a truth most people preferred not to face. Evil does not always announce itself. It does not always roar. More often it whispers. It blends in. It wears kindness as a mask. This is the legacy of silence. Not just the silence of the victims, chained and starved, but the silence of those who looked away. The neighbors who heard cries but told themselves it was the wind. The families who surrendered children and never asked again. The officials who sealed records rather than face scandal. In every layer of silence, the Callahans found protection. And in that protection, their cruelty thrived. Today, when historians reflect on their story, it is not just about a farmhouse in Kentucky. It is about the way horror can grow undisturbed when no one dares to question. It is about the cost children always pay when society decides that silence is easier than truth. The Callahans are gone, their attic dismantled, their name nearly erased. But the questions remain, heavier than any ruins. How many atrocities are hidden in plain sight, disguised as care? How much suffering is tolerated because no one wants to see? Evil often grows in silence, disguised as ordinary life. The Callahans were not demons. They were neighbors, parents, caretakers. Their crimes remind us that horror rarely arrives with a warning. It builds slowly behind locked doors, while others look away. What do you think? Could something like this happen again? Hidden in plain sight behind the mask of kindness?